Sign the papers, Elisa. You brought this upon yourself? Victoria whispered, her voice like ice cutting through the humid evening air. Elisa stared at the heavy iron gates of the estate, her hands trembling. You're giving me to him? To David? He's a monster, Victoria. Everyone knows what he does to those who cross him. You crossed me, Victoria retorted, stepping back into the shadow of the limousine. The Alpha King expects absolute obedience. Consider this your final lesson. Let's see how long you survive under his roof. The heavy steel doors slammed, leaving Elisa alone in the pouring rain as a towering figure stepped out of the mansion's shadow, his gaze piercing through the dark. The rain did not fall so much as it drifted, a heavy, cold mist that clung to the ancient stone walls of the Blackwood estate. Elisa stood on the gravel driveway, her thin trench coat soaked through, her small suitcase clutched in both hands like a shield. Behind her, the tail lights of her stepmother's sleek town car vanished into the winding mountain road, leaving her in complete, suffocating silence. To the rest of the city, David Blackwood was known as the Alpha King, a moniker born not from folklore, but from his ruthless, absolute dominance over the region's shipping and real estate empires. He was a man who broke competitors with a single phone call, whose name was whispered in boardroom meetings with a mixture of reverence and genuine terror. And now, because of a contract her stepmother Victoria had forged in the dark, Elisa belonged to him. It was a punishment. Victoria's final, cruel act to rid herself of the stepdaughter who refused to sign away her late father's remaining shares. The massive oak front door of the mansion groaned open. A tall, silver-haired man in a tailored butler's suit stepped out, holding a large black umbrella. He stopped a respectful distance away, his expression neutral. Yet his eyes held a flicker of something resembling pity. Miss Elisa, the man said, his voice deep and formal. I am Marcus. Please, come inside. The master is expecting you. Elisa swallowed the lump in her throat, her knees shaking as she took her first step forward. Thank you, she whispered, her voice barely audible over the wind. She followed Marcus into the grand foyer. The interior was a stark contrast to the wild, wet forest outside. The floors were polished black marble, reflecting the warm glow of a massive crystal chandelier hanging from a vaulted ceiling. Yet, despite the grandeur, the house felt empty. It possessed the eerie quiet of a museum after hours. You may leave your coat and bag here, Miss Elisa, Marcus said, gesturing to a velvet settee. I will have them dried and brought to your quarters. Elisa peeled off her wet coat, feeling incredibly small in her simple knit sweater and damp jeans. She kept her arms crossed over her chest, trying to stop the shivering that had settled deep into her bones. Is Mr. Blackwood here? The master is in his study, Marcus replied, bowing slightly. He has requested your presence immediately. Please, follow me. Each step down the long, dimly lit hallway felt like a march toward a scaffolding. The walls were lined with dark oil paintings of imposing figures from generations past. The ancestors of the Blackwood dynasty, all of them sharing the same stern, unyielding gaze. Elisa's mind raced with the rumors she had heard. They said David Blackwood was a recluse who tolerated no mistakes, a man whose temper could ruin lives, and who kept his inner circle incredibly small. Victoria had laughed when she signed the transfer agreement, promising Elisa that she would beg to come home within a week. Marcus stopped before a set of massive double doors made of dark mahogany. He knocked twice, a firm, rhythmic sound that echoed in the quiet hallway. Enter, a voice called out from within. The voice was low, rich, and carried a natural cadence of absolute authority. It sent a shiver straight down Elisa's spine, different from the chill of the rain. It was a sound that commanded attention without needing to raise its volume. Marcus opened the door and stepped aside, bowing to Elisa. "Go on, miss." Elisa took a deep breath, steeling herself. She walked into the room, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. The study was vast, lined from floor to ceiling with leather-bound books. A fire crackled in a large stone fireplace, casting dancing shadows across the room. At the far end, behind a massive desk carved from a single piece of dark wood, sat David. He was looking down at a leather folder, a gold fountain pen held loosely in his fingers. He wore a crisp white shirt with the sleeves rolled up to his forearms, revealing strong, tan wrists. His dark hair was brushed back, but a few stray strands fell across his forehead, giving him a rugged, untamed look that contrasted sharply with the luxury of his surroundings. He did not look up immediately. The silence stretched, heavy and thick with tension. Elisa stood near the entrance, her hands clasped tightly in front of her, waiting for the storm to break. When David finally raised his eyes, Elisa felt the air leave her lungs. They were a striking, intense shade of amber brown, sharp, calculating, and entirely unreadable. He did not look like a monster. He looked like a man who had mastered every aspect of his existence, possessing a quiet, lethal grace that made her feel instantly defenseless. His gaze swept over her slowly, taking in her damp hair, her shivering shoulders, and the defensive posture she held. He did not speak for a long moment, simply observing her with an intensity that made her want to shrink into the floorboards. "You are smaller than I expected," David said, his voice calm, carrying no malice, yet carrying a weight that demanded an answer. Elisa squeezed her hands tighter. I apologize if my appearance is not to your standards, Mr. Blackwood." David leaned back in his leather chair, tapping the gold pen against his desk. "Your stepmother spoke highly of your compliance, Elisa. She assured me you were eager to fulfill the terms of our arrangement." A spark of quiet anger flared through Elisa's fear, warming her chest. "My stepmother lied to you. She gave me to you because I refused to let her destroy my father's legacy. This isn't an arrangement. It's a punishment." David's eyebrows rose slightly, a faint flicker of amusement crossing his features before vanishing back into his stoic mask. He stood up, and Elisa had to consciously fight the urge to take a step back. He was tall, broad-shouldered, and moved with a physical presence that dominated the entire room. He walked around the desk, stopping a few feet away from her. The scent of cedarwood, rain, and expensive cologne drifted over her. "A punishment," David repeated, his voice dropping a register. "And you believe I am the executioner? Are you not?" Elisa asked, her voice trembling but her gaze remaining locked on his. "You bought my debt. You forced me to come here. Everyone knows who you are, Mr. Blackwood. You don't take in people out of charity." David looked down at her, his amber eyes narrowing slightly as he analyzed her defiance. "No," he said softly. "I do not do anything out of charity. But you miscalculate your position, Elisa. You are here because Victoria owed this estate a debt she could not pay. You were the collateral she chose to offer. And what do you expect of me?" Elisa asked, her heart racing. "Am I to be a servant? A hostage?" David stepped closer, just enough for her to feel the heat radiating from him. His presence was overwhelming, wrapping around her like a physical force. He reached out, his hand moving slowly. Elisa braced herself, expecting a harsh grip. But his fingers were surprisingly warm and gentle as he lightly touched a wet strand of hair clinging to her cheek, brushing it behind her ear. The contrast of his reputational cruelty and this unexpectedly gentle touch sent a jolt through her. "You are to live here," David said, his voice low and steady, holding her gaze. "You will dine with me. You will walk in my gardens. And you will learn that I do not abuse my guests, regardless of how they arrived." He pulled his hand back, his expression returning to its distant, unreadable state. "Marcus will show you to your room. There are clothes waiting for you. Dry yourself, eat, and rest. We will speak more tomorrow. And if I try to leave?" Elisa challenged softly, her voice carrying the desperation of a caged animal. David turned his back to her, walking back to his desk. "The gates are locked, Elisa. But more importantly, you have nowhere else to go. Your stepmother made sure of that. Sleep well." The guest suite Elisa was given was larger than the entire apartment she had shared with her father before he passed. It was decorated in soft tones of cream and gold, featuring a massive canopy bed, a private fireplace, and a set of French doors that opened to a balcony overlooking the darkened estate grounds. On the bed lay several boxes of high-end clothing, all in her exact size. A detail that made her realize just how thoroughly David had researched her before she even arrived. She showered, letting the hot water wash away the chill of the rain and the grime of the journey. Dressed in a soft, oversized cashmere sweater and comfortable trousers from one of the boxes, she sat by the fireplace, staring into the flames. She thought of her father. He had been a kind, gentle man, a brilliant architect who had been taken advantage of by Victoria. After his sudden death a year ago, Victoria had systematically dismantled everything he built, leaving Elisa with nothing but a small pocket of shares in his final project. Shares Victoria desperately needed to finalize a lucrative merger. Elisa's refusal to sign them over had led directly to this room. "You'll learn to obey." Victoria's parting words echoed in her mind. The next morning, the rain had stopped, replaced by a pale, watery sunlight that filtered through the heavy mist. A knock on her door startled her. It was Marcus, carrying a silver tray with a pot of tea and a light breakfast. "Good morning, Miss Elisa," Marcus said, placing the tray on a small table near the window. "The master has requested your presence in the conservatory at noon. Until then, you are free to explore the house and the inner gardens." Elisa looked at the breakfast: fresh fruit, pastries, and delicate porcelain. "Marcus, is he always this quiet?" Marcus paused, adjusting a cup. "The master is a man of few words, miss. But he notices everything. I suggest you keep that in mind." Taking Marcus's advice, Elisa spent the morning wandering the labyrinthine corridors of the estate. She expected to find locked doors and armed guards, but the house was surprisingly open. The only boundaries seemed to be the massive iron gates at the edge of the property, visible through the tall windows. At noon, she made her way to the conservatory, a massive glass structure filled with exotic plants, blooming orchids, and the earthy scent of damp soil. It was warm inside, the sunlight glass magnified. David was there, standing near a bench, pruning a delicate white rose bush. He was dressed casually in a dark sweater, yet he still looked immensely commanding. He did not turn when she entered, but he spoke as if he knew exactly where she was standing. "Did you sleep well, Elisa?" "I did," she said, stepping further into the warmth of the glass room. Though, I admit, I kept expecting to be locked in. David snipped a dead leaf from the rosebush, his movements precise. I have no need for locks. If you wish to walk out those gates, you may try. But as I said, Victoria has already legally transferred your guardianship and your father's remaining shares to this estate as settlement for her debts. Out there, you have no legal standing, no funds, and no home. Elisa felt a cold dread settle in her stomach. So, I am your prisoner, just with a nicer view. David turned to face her, setting the shears down on a small table. He studied her face, his amber eyes softening slightly as they lingered on the dark circles under her eyes. A prisoner is kept against their will for the captor's benefit. I gain nothing from keeping you here, Elisa, other than satisfying a debt your stepmother owed me. And why keep me? She asked, stepping closer, her voice rising slightly with emotion. Why not just take the shares and let me go? Why force me to live here? David walked toward her, his steps slow and deliberate. He stopped just inches away, his towering height casting her in shadow. Because, he said, his voice dropping to a low, intense rumble that vibrated through her chest. I do not allow Victoria to dictate the terms of my life. She wanted to throw you away to save herself. I chose to see what she was so desperate to hide. He reached out, his hand hovering near her face for a second before his thumb gently brushed her lower lip, which she had been nervously biting. You have your father's eyes, Elisa. Brave, but terrified. I want to see which one wins. The tension in the house grew thicker over the next 3 days. Elisa rarely saw David during the day. He was occupied in his study or away on business. Yet, she felt his presence everywhere. Every meal was prepared to her liking, every book she showed interest in was moved to her bedside table, and the staff treated her with a quiet, respectful deference that she had never experienced under Victoria's roof. On the 4th evening, Marcus informed her that David requested her presence for dinner. It was not a request she could easily refuse. When she entered the formal dining room, she found the table set for 3. David was already there, standing by the window with a glass of dark amber liquid. A moment later, the double doors opened, and Marcus ushered in a man Elisa recognized immediately. Richard Vance, a notorious business associate of her stepmother, and a man who had tried, on multiple occasions, to corner Elisa into signing her shares over. Richard's eyes widened in surprise when he saw Elisa. A smug, unpleasant smile spread across his face. Well, I had heard Victoria settled her accounts with the Blackwood Group, but I didn't realize she had thrown in the family jewels. Elisa stiffened, her hands clenching into fists at her sides. The familiar fear of Richard's aggressive business tactics reared its head, making her feel small and vulnerable. Sit, Richard, David said, his voice flat, completely devoid of warmth. He did not look at Richard, his eyes remaining fixed on Elisa as he gestured to the chair opposite her. Elisa took her seat, her heart pounding. Richard sat beside her, his presence suffocating. Throughout the first course, Richard spoke loudly about business, clearly trying to impress David while throwing subtle, patronizing barbs at Elisa. It's a shame about your father's company, Elisa, Richard said, taking a sip of wine. If only you had been more cooperative, we could have saved it. Now, you're just domestic help for Mr. Blackwood, I assume? Elisa kept her eyes on her plate, refusing to give him the satisfaction of seeing her cry. My father's company was stolen, Richard. You and Victoria know that better than anyone. Richard laughed, a harsh, dismissive sound. Stolen is a strong word, my dear. It was simply restructured. And now that you're here under David's custody, I suppose we can finally finalize the transfer of those pesky remaining shares. I brought the papers with me, actually. He reached into his breast pocket, but before he could pull the document out, a sharp, metallic sound echoed through the room. David had set his fork down. It was a simple action, but the absolute stillness that followed it was deafening. The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. "Richard," David said, his voice dangerously quiet. Richard froze, his smile faltering. "Yes, David?" "You are a guest in my home," David said, his amber eyes locking onto Richard with a predatory intensity that made the older man visibly pale. "But you seem to have mistaken my hospitality for tolerance. I apologize, David. I was only—" "Elisa is not a servant, nor is she a bargaining chip for your petty schemes," David interrupted, his voice calm, yet carrying a terrifying edge of absolute authority. "She is under my protection. If you speak to her in that tone again, or if you bring business papers into my dining room, I will personally ensure that your shipping licenses are revoked by sunrise." Richard swallowed hard, his face turning a mottled red. He looked at David, then at Elisa, realization dawning on him. The feared Alpha King, a man known for his cold, unyielding nature, was actively shielding the girl. "Of course," Richard stammered, placing his hands on the table. "My apologies, Miss Elisa. I meant no disrespect." Elisa looked up, her eyes wide as she stared at David. He was not looking at Richard. His intense, protective gaze was fixed entirely on her. For the first time, she saw a crack in his icy exterior, a deep, burning intensity that had nothing to do with business and everything to do with her. "Marcus," David called out, his eyes never leaving Elisa's. "Show Mr. Vance to the door. Our dinner is concluded." As Richard was hurried out of the room, leaving his meal untouched, Elisa sat in the quiet dining room, her heart hammering for an entirely different reason. The man everyone feared, the monster her stepmother had sent her to as a punishment, had just drawn a line in the sand to protect her. "Why did you do that?" she whispered into the silence. David stood up, walking around the long table until he stood right beside her. He leaned down, his face close to hers, the scent of him wrapping around her. "Because, Elisa," he murmured, his voice thick with an emotion he could no longer entirely hide. "Nobody threatens what belongs in my house, especially not you." The silence that followed Richard Vance's departure was thick, almost physical. Elisa sat frozen at the expansive dining table, the distant sound of the front door closing echoing through the high-ceilinged room. Her hands, still resting on her lap, trembled slightly. Across from her, David stood with uncharacteristic stillness, his amber eyes watching her with an intensity that made the air feel thin. "You should eat," David said softly, breaking the quiet. He walked back to his chair but did not sit. Instead, he rested his hands on the high wooden back, his knuckles white. "You barely touched your dinner. Why did you do that?" Elisa asked again, her voice a whisper that seemed to carry the weight of all her confusion. She looked up, searching his face for any sign of a hidden motive. "Richard Vance could ruin your shipping logistics in the eastern sector. I know how much power his family holds. You risked a major alliance for what? To protect me?" David's jaw tightened. He looked down at the polished mahogany table, the flicker of the chandelier reflecting in his dark eyes. "Vance is a parasite," he said, his voice flat but carrying a deep, resonant undercurrent of anger. "He preys on those he deems weak, I do not tolerate his kind in my home, nor do I allow them to threaten my guests. I am not just a guest, David, Elisa said, using his first name for the first time. The sound of it seemed to startle them both, hanging in the air like a bridge across a chasm. I am a transaction. My stepmother traded me to settle a debt. You have every right to treat me as such. David stepped around the table, his movements slow, deliberate, and entirely devoid of the predatory edge he had shown to Vance. He stopped a few feet from her chair, looking down at her with expression that was surprisingly vulnerable. "Is that what you truly believe?" he asked, his voice dropping to a low rumble. "That I see you as a transaction?" Elisa looked away, unable to hold his intense gaze. What else am I supposed to think? I was brought here in the dark, forced into a contract I never agreed to. You are the Alpha King. You didn't get that name by being merciful. A dry, humorless chuckle escaped David's lips. The Alpha King is a title created by men who are afraid of their own shadows. They want to believe I am a monster because it excuses their own failures to stand against me. He reached out, his hand pausing in midair before gently resting on the back of her chair, close enough that she could feel the heat radiating from his arm. My father was a harsh man, Elisa. He taught me that power was the only currency that mattered. But he died alone, surrounded by enemies and artificial loyalty. I built this empire to ensure no one could ever force me into a corner again. I did not build it to become him. He leaned down slightly, bringing his face closer to hers. The subtle scent of cedar and rain enveloped her, steadying her racing heart. Your stepmother thought she was punishing you by sending you here. She thought I would break you, and in doing so, break the last piece of your father's spirit. But she miscalculated. How? Elisa whispered, her breath hitching. Because she doesn't know what it's like to value something precious, David murmured, his amber eyes softening as they traced the contours of her face. She only knows how to destroy. I saw you, Elisa, standing in the rain, holding that battered suitcase like a shield. And I didn't see a transaction. I saw someone who had survived a war I know all too well. He stood up straight, pulling his hand back, though his gaze remained locked on hers. Sleep well tonight, Elisa. Tomorrow the rain returns, but you are safe inside. The following afternoon, the forecast proved correct. A relentless gray sheet of rain blanketed the Blackwood estate, turning the lush gardens into a blur of deep greens and dark soils. Elisa stood by the tall window in the library, a leather-bound journal of her father's architectural sketches resting open in her lap. She had found it in a box Marcus had delivered to her room earlier, a small collection of personal items recovered from her old home. As she traced her finger over her father's elegant, precise drawings of historical bridges, she heard the muffled sound of a raised voice from the hallway. It was rare for anyone to raise their voice in the Blackwood mansion. Curious, and with a growing sense of unease, Elisa closed the book and walked softly to the heavy wooden door of the library, cracking it open just enough to peer into the corridor. I don't care about the legal technicalities, Victoria. David's voice rang out, cold and razor-sharp. He was standing near the grand staircase, his phone pressed to his ear. The shares are registered under Elisa's name. Any attempt to finalize the merger without her physical signature will be treated as corporate fraud. I will have my legal team file an injunction before the market opens tomorrow. Elisa held her breath, her heart hammering. Her stepmother was trying to push the merger through anyway, completely ignoring the transfer agreement. Do not threaten me, David continued, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper that sent a thrill of fear and admiration through Elisa. You transferred her guardianship to this estate to escape your debts. You relinquished your claim to her decisions. If you attempt to contact her, or if I see one of your associates near this property again, I will personally dismantle your holding company block by block. I have the resources, Victoria. And unlike you, I have the patience. He ended the call with a sharp swipe of his thumb, standing in the dim light of the hallway with his shoulders tense, his breathing heavy. Elisa stepped out of the library, the heavy door clicking shut behind her. David spun around, his expression instantly shifting from cold fury to a guarded, anxious softness when he saw her. "How much of that did you hear?" he asked, pocketing his phone. "Enough," Elisa said, walking slowly toward him. "She's not going to stop, is she? Victoria will find a way to forge my signature. She's done it before with my father's medical documents near the end. She's desperate." David walked to meet her, stopping just outside her personal space. "She is desperate because she is running out of options. The Blackwood Group has quietly acquired 40% of her primary creditor's debt. I am not just blocking her, Elisa. I am systematically buying the ground she stands on." Elisa stared at him, her eyes wide with realization. "You're doing this for my father's legacy. Why? You didn't even know him." "I knew his work," David said, his gaze drifting to the journal she held against her chest. "He was a man who built things to last. He believed in structure, in beauty, in creating connections between divided spaces. Your stepmother is a destroyer. I dislike destroyers." He looked back at her, his amber eyes burning with an intensity that made her chest tighten. "And I dislike seeing you look at the gates as if they are your prison, when the real prison is the fear she left you with." "I'm not afraid of her anymore," Elisa said, her voice stronger than it had been since she arrived. "Not when I'm here." David's expression softened, a rare, genuine smile touching the corners of his lips. "Good. Because tomorrow we leave the estate." The sky was a pale, clean blue when the sleek black sedan pulled to a stop near the edge of the river. The air was crisp, carrying the sharp, fresh scent of autumn leaves and damp earth. Elisa stepped out of the car, looking up at the massive stone and steel structure that spanned the wide river. It was the St. Jude Bridge, her father's masterpiece, and the very project Victoria had been trying to sell to a demolition and redevelopment firm. "I don't understand," Elisa said, her voice catching in her throat as she stared at the elegant stone arches. "How did we get past the security? Victoria's partners had this site locked down." David stepped up beside her, hands slid casually into the pockets of his dark overcoat. "They did. Until 9 o'clock this morning, when the Historical Preservation Society, funded by a private trust, successfully designated this bridge as a protected landmark. The redevelopment project is officially dead." Elisa turned to him, her eyes shining with unshed tears. "The private trust. That was you. Your father spent 10 years designing this, Elisa," David said, looking up at the bridge. "It was meant to connect the old city with the new development, a physical representation of progress meeting history. It would have been a crime to let them tear it down for luxury high-rises." "You did this for me," she whispered, stepping closer to him. The emotional wall she had built up over the past year, the defense mechanisms against Victoria's cruelty, the fear of being used, the belief that she was entirely alone, crumbled in an instant. "I did it because it was the right thing to do," David said, turning to look down at her. And because I wanted to see you smile. A real smile, not the polite one you use to hide your fear. Elisa reached out, her hand trembling slightly as she rested her fingers against his chest. She could feel the steady, powerful beat of his heart beneath his coat. David, I don't know how to thank you. I thought, when I was brought to your estate, I thought my life was over. I thought you were just another version of the people who took everything from me. David placed his hand over hers, his fingers warm and incredibly gentle as he pressed her palm against his chest. I know what they say about me, Elisa. I know what I have had to do to survive in this world. But with you, I don't want to be the Alpha King. I just want to be the man who keeps you safe. He leaned down, his forehead resting gently against hers. The proximity was electric, a tense, breathless moment where the world around them seemed to fade into nothing but the sound of the rushing river and their own shared breath. Elisa closed her eyes, leaning into his warmth, feeling a sense of peace she hadn't known since her father was alive. You are free, Elisa, David murmured, his voice thick with emotion. You can leave. The shares are secure, your father's legacy is safe, and I have set up a trust in your name. You never have to see Victoria again. You don't have to stay at the estate. Elisa opened her eyes, looking into the amber depths of his. And what if I don't want to leave? Before David could answer, his phone vibrated sharply in his pocket, shattering the fragile peace of the moment. David frowned, pulling the phone out. He stared at the screen, his expression instantly hardening back into the cold, calculated mask of the Alpha King. He slid the phone back into his pocket and looked down at Elisa, his eyes filled with a sudden, sharp anxiety. What is it? Elisa asked, a cold dread settling in her stomach. Marcus just called, David said, his voice tense. A courier delivered a package to the estate. It's a safety deposit box key, registered in your father's name, along with a note from his old personal assistant, Arthur. The note says the box contains the original, unedited diaries of your father's partnership negotiations with Victoria. If we have those, we can prove corporate theft without a long civil trial. Arthur was my father's most trusted friend, Elisa said, her heart racing. If he had those, why didn't he give them to me before? He was scared, David said, walking her back toward the car. Victoria threatened his family. But according to the note, he's leaving the country tonight and wanted to make sure you had the truth. The box is at the downtown branch of the Metro Trust Bank. We have to go, Elisa said, her determination overriding her fear. If those diaries are real, we can end this tonight. The drive to the downtown bank was silent, filled with a mounting tension. David was focused on the road, his hands tight on the steering wheel, while Elisa clutched her father's journal to her chest. When they arrived at the grand, stone-faced bank, David insisted on going in with her, but the branch manager stopped him at the vault entrance. I apologize, Mr. Blackwood, the manager said, bowing slightly in deference to David's status. But the safety deposit vault protocol is absolute. Only the registered beneficiary, Miss Elisa, and a designated bank officer are permitted inside the private viewing rooms. No exceptions, even for you. David's eyes narrowed, a predatory growl nearly escaping his throat. I don't care about your protocols. David, it's fine, Elisa said, placing a hand on his arm to soothe his rising temper. It's a secure bank. There are guards everywhere. I'll just get the box and come right back out. David looked at her, his amber eyes filled with an intense, protective reluctance. 10 minutes, Elisa. If you are not out in 10 minutes, I am bringing this door down. 10 minutes, she promised with a small, reassuring smile. She followed the bank officer down the cold, tiled corridor into the vault room. The heavy steel door clicked shut behind them, isolating her in a quiet, sterile space lined with small brass doors. The officer pulled a long metal box from a shelf, placed it on a table in a small, private viewing room, and bowed. "I will leave you to examine the contents, Miss Elisa." As the officer left, closing the private door, Elisa reached for the key. But before she could insert it into the lock, the door behind her opened again. "You always were too trusting, Elisa," a cold, familiar voice whispered. Elisa spun around, her breath catching in her throat. Standing in the doorway was Victoria, her expression twisted into a triumphant, bitter smile, accompanied by a tall, heavy-set man in a dark suit holding a suppressed pistol. "Did you really think Arthur would help you?" Victoria sneered, stepping into the room. "The key was a lure, darling, and you walked right into the cage." Elisa backed away until her spine hit the cold metal safety deposit boxes. Her heart hammered against her ribs, but she forced herself to look Victoria in the eyes. "You can't do this here, Victoria. David is right outside. The moment I don't walk out, he will tear this place apart. Let him try," Victoria retorted, her voice dripping with venom. "By the time he realizes you're gone, you'll be on a private flight out of the country. I have a power of attorney document here, Elisa. You're going to sign it, transferring the remaining shares to my holding company, or your dear Mr. Blackwood will receive a very tragic phone call regarding your safety." "I won't sign it," Elisa said, her voice steady despite the trembling in her knees. "My father died because of your greed. I won't let you steal the last thing he built." Victoria nodded to the armed man. "Make her sign. We don't have time." The man stepped forward, raising the weapon. But before he could take a second step, the heavy mahogany door of the private room did not just open. It shattered inward, wood splinters flying through the air. David stood in the doorway, his silhouette imposing and terrifying. His amber eyes were no longer warm. They burned with a lethal, ancient fury that made even the armed man hesitate. "Drop it," David said, his voice low, steady and carrying the weight of a physical blow. The guard turned his weapon toward David, but David moved with a quiet, terrifying speed. In a fraction of a second, he closed the distance, his hand gripping the guard's wrist with enough force to make the bones pop. The gun fell to the floor with a dull thud, and David threw the man against the concrete wall, knocking him unconscious instantly. Victoria shrieked, backing away as David turned his gaze to her. The sheer aura of power radiating from him filled the small room, making it feel as if the oxygen had been sucked out. "David, please," Victoria stammered, her face pale, all her arrogance vanishing in the face of his wrath. "You have 10 seconds to leave this city, Victoria," David said, his voice dangerously quiet, vibrating with a force that made the glass fixtures rattle. "My associates have already finalized the acquisition of your primary creditors. Your assets are frozen. Your homes are foreclosed. If you are still in this country by midnight, I will hand the evidence of your financial fraud to the federal authorities myself." Victoria stared at him, terrified, before scrambling out of the room, leaving her bodyguard on the floor. David did not watch her go. He turned to Elisa, his entire demeanor shifting in an instant. The terrifying, cold Alpha King vanished, replaced by a man who looked desperately, deeply relieved. He stepped toward her, his hands shaking slightly as he reached out to cup her face. "Are you hurt?" he asked, his voice thick with a raw, desperate emotion. "Did she touch you?" "I'm fine," Elisa whispered, tears finally spilling over her eyelashes. "I'm fine because you came." David pulled her into his arms, holding her so tightly she could feel the rapid rise and fall of his chest. "I thought, when I heard the alarm, I thought I had lost you." He murmured against her hair, his grip tightening. "I have built an empire, Elisa. I have fought armies of men who wanted to destroy me. But nothing has ever terrified me more than the thought of a world without you in it." He pulled back slightly, looking down at her with a vulnerability that took her breath away. "I love you, Elisa, uncontrollably. From the moment I saw you in the rain, I was yours. Not as a captor, not as a guardian, but as a man who wants to spend the rest of his life earning your trust." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, elegant velvet box, opening it to reveal a simple, stunning diamond ring set in a band designed to look like the arches of her father's bridge. "I don't want to keep you in a cage," David said, his voice steady but filled with hope. "I want to build a life with you. Will you stay with me, Elisa? Of your own free will?" Elisa looked at the ring, then up into the amber eyes of the man who had torn down her walls and rebuilt her world with safety, respect, and love. "Yes," she whispered, a brilliant, true smile lighting up her face. "I will stay." The storm had finally passed, leaving the estate bathed in the warm, golden glow of a late afternoon sun. Elisa and David walked hand in hand through the inner gardens, the air sweet with the scent of blooming jasmine and wet earth. The gates of the estate stood wide open, a symbol of a freedom they had fought for and won together. They were no longer bound by contracts, debts, or fear, but by a love that had grown from the ashes of their pasts, uncontrollable, fierce, and enduring. If you loved this story of emotional twists, fierce protection, and uncontrollable love, please support us. Like, share, and subscribe to receive notifications for the next exciting romance and drama releases.